So, good morning, everyone, and very welcome to the second day of the CEPS Ideas Lab. It is a pleasure to have you see in person, to have you here in person. And I think that the topic of today is really one of the most important ones in the EU policy debate. So I think there will be good discussion for it, and we have a fantastic lineup of speakers. A lot of ideas, a lot of views. To start with, I would like to invite Ricardo Hausmann. He's professor at the University of Harvard Kennedy School, and he's also the director of the Harvard Growth Lab. Ricardo has done an impressive amount of work on growth and development over many years, and today he will share with us his idea and his thoughts about complexity and economic complexity in particular, and how this links to industrial policy. Ricardo, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. I hope my voice accompanies me for the talk. I'm at the end of a cold and it's playing games on me. I want to say, I want to start with a personal note. The first one is that, I'm from Venezuela. I'm a professor at Harvard, but my mother was born in Anderlecht. Right. so right next door, and it's I still have family here in Belgium, and so it's a personal pleasure to be here. An occasion to remember her. Second, I want to say something about the European Union. Let me say it's a comment on the European Union that would be completely intuitive for a Latin American. I want to say that the European Union looks like the most ambitious political project humanity has ever attempted. There is nothing quite as ambitious and as difficult as what the European Union represents. The European Union is composed of 27 countries that speak almost 27 or 35 different languages, or I don't know how many, 6 in Spain. They've been at war with each other, etc. Latin America is composed of 18 countries that speak the same language, have the same dominant religion, have never been at war. We can't get any kind of union together. We can't open up our markets. We can't do anything. And so compared to how difficult it has been for us, it looked impossible for you, and look at where you are. So chapeau, I'm really impressed. So let me say that I'll start with something that looks to me like a puzzle, that I think has deep implications for how we should think about what drives the economy. And the puzzle is that the world is converging in many dimensions except the ones that matter, or in many dimensions, but at least one that matters is not converging. And I think that the economic complexity approach has something to tell us about why. And it's going to lead to some justification for something that you might want to call industrial policy. It may look a little bit different from the way people talk about industrial policy, but it's not kind of these horizontal things where the government just puts very general conditions and lets the market do the rest. There's going to be more work to be done than that. So I'm going to try to define what are the dimensions in which you want to think of this quote-unquote industrial policy, or whatever you want to call it, because it's going to be, I'm going to argue, very high-dimensional policy. It's not going to be the way we talk about it. How many $1 billion did you put there? That would be a one-dimensional thing. It's not going to be like that. And then I'm going to say something about European industrial policy and the green transition. So let me see if I get there. I have 20 minutes and I've already wasted a few. So first, the world has seen a massive convergence in many, many dimensions that we associate with development. Gaps have been narrowing dramatically in things like life expectancy, fertility rates, education. Gaps in education across the world are in 93% of the countries have narrowed and quite dramatically. Female empowerment, female labor force participation, female enrollment. All these gaps have been narrowing dramatically. Urbanization gaps have been narrowing. Investment gaps have been narrowing. Relative to the US, the majority of the countries have a higher investment ratio than the US. So everybody has been sort of like moving in the right direction. So this, if you put that in a basic model, ceteris paribus, income should converge. And yet, what we have seen is that there has been no narrowing of income gaps. They have widened. And the puzzle is even bigger. They have widened, conditional on all of these things narrowing. So the only way to explain this is with widening technological gaps. But how would you explain widening technological gaps if we thought that technology would flow naturally through trade, through education, through et cetera? And by the way, supposedly it's harder to invent technology than to adopt technology. So if you're catching up, you're just adopting, you should be narrowing the gap with those that have to invent. Well, it happens that those that are inventing faster than you are adopting. Why the hell? Okay, so here what I have is a graph where I've taken all the countries in the world that were poorer than the US in 1980. I split them in 5 quintiles in terms of how fast they grew since 1980. And so the top quintile is the yellow one. That's the fastest growing one. 1 means relative to the US. So relative to the US, that group has grown 3 times more than the US. They've grown a hell of a lot. So 25% of countries grew a hell of a lot. But the median country actually fell behind. And and the other 2 quintiles fell dramatically behind. Okay, so that's a puzzle I want to leave. So I think that puzzle, it makes more sense to explain in the context of the economic complexity approach. The alternative to the economic complexity approach is if you want, a very neoclassical approach that thinks that the world is made out of these substances. There's an output on the one hand, and it's made out of, it comes out of a black box that has technology, capital, labor, and human capital. And those are the substances. So I think it's a very classical approach. I would say it's an even Greek approach in the sense that the Greeks believed that these were the fundamental elements of the world, okay? That this was the constituent matter of the world. And you're trying to explain what happens in the world with these fundamental substances. And I'm going to say, maybe the world is not made out of these fundamental substances. It's made out of these fundamental substances. And the difference between the two is that these fundamental substances combine and give rise to some emergent properties that were not there in the substance, right? So you have these fundamental atoms, they combine into molecules, into more complicated molecules like DNA, into assemblies of molecules like cells, that they give rise to complicated things like this, and then to more complicated things like social animals, and they end up in things like this, okay? So there's this process of combining things and having emergent properties that were not part of the fundamental elements. Okay, so here I'm going to say that technology is essentially knowledge that takes 3 forms. Knowledge that has been embedded into things like tools and materials. So the knowledge to make the tool is in the tool. You don't need to know how to make the tool, to use the tool. That knowledge is already embedded. And we thought for a long time that technology is all embedded technology, so if you open up to trade, you get it. It's also codified knowledge, codes, recipes, formulas, algorithms, how to do manuals. But it's also tacit knowledge in brains. And here you have a dentist. The dentist is using tools. The dentist is following protocols, so he's using tools and codes, but he's mixing it with something you and I don't have, which is the ability to look into the mouth and see things we wouldn't see, and the ability to use the tools in ways we wouldn't know how to use. Okay, so that combination of three things is what I want to call technology. Now, tools are easy to ship around. So if a country lags behind, just send them the tools, right? Codes are even easier to share. Put them on the web and everybody has access to it. But know-how is a little bit more complicated in two dimensions. The first one is that know-how doesn't move from brain to brain very easily. If you had a conversation with Rafa Nadal, I don't think your tennis game will improve. So it's not information, okay? Okay. And secondly, it's knowledge that exists in teams, not in individuals. Now you might say, well, this lady knows how to implement this technology, but that would be to misspeak. Because to implement this technology, you need all these other people. Actually, the product is the combination of adding up all these different forms of knowledge that go into the product. So it's a little bit like, you know, a person doesn't know how to play a symphony. It's not to a person to play a symphony. It's the aggregation of these bits of knowledge that creates the product. So different companies will have different amounts of knowledge embedded in them. You look at the social network of what underpins the business and you realize that these can be perfectly family businesses. The companies that make these products cannot be family businesses. And you might say that this product cannot be even made by a country, right? This product is really made by all of these companies across all of these geographies. And it's not because they're going to make many airplanes. They have to be there just to make one airplane, right? So it's not economies of scale. It's an aggregation of knowledge that goes into these things. So I'm going to describe the world in this non-Greek way, okay, this atomic way. I'm going to say that the world is composed of three kind of things. One is a set of capabilities, the ability to produce transformations in the world, okay? These different processes that different people know about. You know, to run a company, you need to know about accounting, finance, marketing, human resource management, contracts, taxes, information systems. I can go on. These are sort of like these capabilities. Places in the world, whether you're talking about NUTS 3, NUTS 2, countries, you know, are subsets of these capabilities. And products are combinations of these capabilities. Okay? So I can characterize the world as being composed of an endowment matrix of which places have which letters. If you want, a technology matrix of which letters go into which products, okay? And then I can observe which places are able to make which products as an indication of places have the letters with which to make these products. And if this is the nature of the world, and I'm talking about products, I could have talked about technologies, I could have talked about scientific innovations. They're all combinations of knowledge, okay? So what I want to infer is the following thing. The country at the top has a lot of letters. The country at the bottom has very few letters. Now notice that the country at the top, because it has all those letters, is able to make all 5 products. So the country at the bottom only makes 1 product. So I'm going to argue the more letters you have, the more products you can make. Okay, so as you increase the number of letters, the diversity of your production goes up. Now look at it from the other side. Hat is a very short word, only has 3 letters. Just so happens that everybody makes hats in this graph, right? But pharmaceuticals is a very long word. I actually cheated in making the graph, no? it's only made by one country, right? And which country makes it? The one that has a lot of letters. So I'm going to call the ubiquity of a product, the number of countries that make a product, okay? So long words are going to be hard to make. They're going to be made in fewer places. They're going to be less ubiquitous. And short words are going to be easy to make, so they're going to be made in many places. So they're going to be ubiquitous, okay? So we conclude that as countries acquire more letters or places, they should express those letters in more products, more diversification, but also in products that are harder to make, less ubiquitous products. Interestingly enough, that's what we observe when we look across the world, who makes what. Okay, so on the x-axis, you have how diversified our countries. On the y-axis is how ubiquitous are the products that, on average, they make. And you have this relationship that's what you would expect to see if the world was atomic. It's not what you would expect to see if there was earth, water, wind, and fire. Right? But also, that's what we observe if we look at scientific publications. Some countries make everything, a lot of things. Others make few things. But the ones that make everything make things that are done in few places, and the ones that make few things do things that are done everywhere, like in HAT, okay? So that happens with scientific publications. It also happens with patents, okay? So countries that are able to patent in many, many fields, patent in fields that very few people are able to patent in, and the ones that patent in few things, patent in fields that everybody can patent in. Okay, so it's a little bit the same logic. Okay, with that we are able to kind of estimate how many letters a country has. We can do this at the NUTS 3 level, how many letters a place has, right? And when we try to ask the question, why did some countries converge and other countries not converge? This is a graph I showed you before. It's the one that accumulated letters. So it is growth in this space that we're trying to capture and measure, this accumulation of capabilities, okay? So very simple. So just accumulate letters, accumulate capabilities. What's the problem? Okay? Well, we are going to think about innovation and invention in different dimensions here. The first one is, you might say, you invent a new capability, like somebody invents electricity, okay? That's like a new letter. Obviously, that's going to trigger people trying to figure out how can they include that letter in doing other things. Okay? Other times, you're not inventing any new capability. You're just inventing a new way of putting things together. The people who invented the bicycle did not invent any of the components of the bicycle. They just invented a new way of putting these components together. So one innovation would say you invent new letters. Other innovation says you invent new words. Not necessarily new letters, new combinations of letters that are meaningful, new words. And obviously, there are some combinations of the two. So if you invent the electricity and somebody had invented the bicycle, maybe you invent the electric bicycle, right? Or the electric toothbrush, or so. Okay, so what happens, and that means there is a set of industrial policies, if you want. That is, if you want, at this technological frontier. The government says, or society wants, some innovation in some new capability, like fusion, right? Or AI, right? And then other people say, where do I put AI into? What kind of product how do I change products to incorporate this new letter, right? That might be at the technological frontier. It has nothing to do with a place. The US prides itself to have been pushed solar panels in the world, but the industry ended up in China. But the technology was developed a little bit thanks to the Germans and the Americans. So you wanted to push the frontier, it doesn't say where it's going to land, but you push the frontier, now we have them. So what happens when a place develops? When you think about development in a place, how does this look like? Well, development is about acquisition of capabilities. So it's about getting letters you didn't have before. And because you now have new letters, you can make new words, and you can make longer words, more complex production. So the process of development, think of the backward regions of Europe. It's about them changing what they're able to do towards more diversification, more complex production, more words, longer words. And that's why there's no such thing in my mind as smart specialization. There is only smart diversification. That you already know to do what you know, you're going to add to the things that you know how to do other things that you were not able to do before. Now what can go wrong with technology adoption? Why would we ever need a government involved in this story? I think part of the role of government is that there are serious coordination failures, like missing markets. There are public goods and there are knowledge spillovers. And this may make the markets trample on itself, okay? The typical coordination problem is this philosophical problem that you all know about, right? That you cannot make watches without watchmakers. But how do you become a watchmaker in a place that doesn't make watches? To do something, you need to know how to do it, but you don't know how to do the things you don't do. So how do you start doing the things you don't do? If to do them, you have to know how to do them, but you don't know how to do the things you don't do, right? So how do we solve that problem? The world gives evidence that it tramples on this problem, and this problem is somehow associated with this other classification problem. If I ask you which two animals are similar to each other and which one is out of the group, is different, okay? Well, you can apply many theories to this classification problem. You'd say some are from Africa, the others are not, some eat grass, the others don't. But if you apply this atomic theory, you'll realize that a zebra is just a bear with an extra Z. Right? So if you want to go from bear to zebra, you have to solve one chicken and egg problem. If you want to go from bear to lion, you have 4 letters that you don't need, and you need 4 letters that you don't have, right? So there are some of these transitions are going to be nearby, and other of these transitions are going to be far away. So this intuition allows us to figure out what transitions are more likely to be feasible than others, okay? And we can apply these to products. So this is the product space. It's an attempt to represent technology in a certain way, that every circle here is a product and it's linked to other things if you need more or less the same capabilities to do both, right? So like bear and zebra would be close to each other, bear and lion would be far away. But we can use these tools for other things like scientific publications, scientific areas, or technology patents. And we can use these maps to place countries in the map and to figure out what's in their adjacent possible. What things are like, what are the zebras to their bears, okay? How can we move in that space? And with this, we can develop tools that allow us to analyze which things are feasible for a certain place, and on the things that are feasible, which ones look more strategic or more attractive or less attractive, which they would be more attractive if a move in that direction opens you to further opportunities for continued diversification. And we can make these things very precise. So, what if you are in a place, NUTS 3, NUTS 2, a country, or even Europe, you would want to know what industries are near your current set of capabilities, which ones are more attractive, can you identify the missing letters, can you make sure that those letters are provided? Now, here we enter one particular problem, which is the problem of public goods, okay? Now, you can go out in a market and buy a car, but a car is only going to be useful if the car can use roads, if those roads are used with people who follow traffic rules, there are traffic signs, there are traffic lights, there are traffic cops. So the technology is a technology that you can buy in a market, but it lives in a universe of public goods. And these public goods are not law and order and so on. These public goods are relatively specific to the industry. That's one of the reasons why high-speed rail does not exist in the US. Because you cannot go and buy it in the market, right? It is too dependent on complementary public goods that in their absence cannot happen. Now, private goods that have a market have this beautiful invisible hand with which you can coordinate things. I hope you appreciate how difficult it was for me to find the picture of an invisible hand. But the invisible hand allows systems to self-organize. And they self-organize because the invisible hand has three elements. It has an information system, which is the price system. With prices, you can calculate the difference between the price of the output and the cost of the inputs. With that, you can calculate profits if you want. But profits is not just a calculation. It's an incentive system. So it includes an incentive system. It's an information system and an incentive system. And then you have capital markets or financial markets that are trying to allocate resources to those that are expected to be profitable, which are those that are correctly responding to the information contained in prices. So that's the secret of this invisible hand. However, public goods don't self-organize. They don't have prices. They don't have a profit motive. Typically in the public sector, a profit motive is something we call corruption. And there's no decentralized mechanism for allocating resources. There are centralized budget processes. So because of that, public goods don't self-organize, and we have to organize them through the political process. And they're complementary to everything else. Okay? Now the problem is, how do you organize in a context in which you have no information, no incentive to respond to the information, and no automatic resource mobilization mechanism? How is that done? So where do you get the information? Where do you get the incentive to respond? How do you mobilize resources? I would put it to you that this is a central piece of why you need productive policies to accompany the process of growth, because public goods are relatively specific and not self-organizing. So the role of industrial policy is to figure out what things industries need, because production requires relatively specific public goods, and there might be missing inputs, like there are no clockmakers, no watchmakers. So giving money to firms does not solve this problem. So if you think that it all ends up in a budget to allocate to firms, it doesn't, because firms may need things they cannot buy, or they are missing markets that they cannot complete. So you need to sort out what's missing, but you don't have a clue, because there are thousands of government agencies that might be involved, one of them, or millions of pages of legislation. So the obstacles may lurk anywhere, so you need some kind of information revelation process to help you figure out what's missing. Okay? And you cannot assign ex ante. You cannot say, well, this is the responsibility of the Ministry of Tourism, because maybe the tourists are not coming in because there are no visas, or maybe the tourists are not coming in because there are no hotels, and there are no hotels because there are no building permits. Or so it's not the responsibility of the Ministry of Tourism to deal with any of that. So. So these problems are going to be particularly serious at the extensive margin, at the margin of new industries, because industries that exist can complain and they'll lobby you, but industries that don't yet exist don't talk, right? So governments are pretty bad at providing the goods that are needed by those that exist, but they're hopeless at the ones that don't exist, right? So you need organizations that can explore this space of possibilities. Okay, so you may not know what to do, but you know that you don't know. And I think that industrial policies are these processes of information revelation where you try to solve your ignorance. You design them in ignorance because you're ignorant, okay? So policies involve some kind of information revelation and requires reimagining some institutions to play that role. For example, I wrote a paper called Smart Development Banks, which says that development banks are wasting a lot of their resources, a lot of their function by just deciding whether a project is viable or not, but not by informing about what does the market seem to think is viable, why do you think it's not viable, what would make it more viable, Should we provide something to make it more viable? Are there some missing public goods that increase the risk? So they could become an important intelligence agency for the government, for the set of possibilities of things that could be happening and are not happening, but good. So I think that these kinds of institutions have that potential capacity. So their importance is in solving problems. It's not in their ability to distribute cash, right? The cash might be a conversation piece to bring people in, for people to reveal information of what they have in mind, etc. But we should evaluate them in terms of the opportunities they identify, the obstacles they identify, the coordination that they can provide to resolve, and so on. This needs to be a pretty high bandwidth policy. Industries need very different public goods and face very different coordination failures. Markets face very different distortions. And so horizontal policies are not going to work. You want to be as horizontal as possible, but you'll have to be as vertical as necessary. That, you know, people are not going to buy electric cars until they are assured that if they run out of juice, there'll be a charging station nearby. Well, that's going to be important for that industry. It's going to be irrelevant for everybody else, but it's a public good needed by that industry. So if you want that industry, you'll have to solve that coordination problem. So how many different industrial policies you need? Is it 10 to 0, like just one industrial policy, or 10 to 1, or 10 to 2, 10 to 3? The used to be called the MITI in Japan, now it's called the METI. They have 230 some deliberation councils. So I'm going to say that we need something like 10 to 2. Just to place it in order of magnitude. How many conversations at the same time do you need to be able to have? So in my mind, most countries have an inadequate communication mechanism. They have too few conversations, and they're trying to narrow too much the conversations. In order to narrow the conversations, they want to set priorities. But they don't know, you shouldn't prioritize on things that are not expensive. Much of this is not expensive. So you better invest in increasing your bandwidth rather than reducing your attention span. So the variety of instruments also has to be very, very large, because industries differ in many dimensions. There's existing industries versus new industries. There's globally mature technologies versus nascent technologies. There's globally mature markets versus new markets. There are need to light versus heavy technological adaptation to your location. So is this something that's plug and play, or does it require, you know, more effort to implement locally? Can you start small and let it grow, or can you only start at 2 million tons a year? Otherwise, you're not efficient. So, what is the growth path of this industry? Does it have these lumpy investments? Do you have agents of change that can implement the policy, or you have a lot of foreign direct investment, or you have large national champions that can do things, or do you have diasporas that you can mobilize, or do you have, so there are different agents of change. Let me say something quickly on the green transition. The first thing is that the current approach has a little bit of at least in the international scale, I don't know if within Europe, but it's focused on having the world reduce global emissions by having every country focus on lowering their emissions, with the idea that if every country lowers its emissions, the world will have lower the emissions. And so we have Paris, and we have national development contributions, and then we help countries achieve those national development contributions. But for the world to lower its emissions, the world is going to need a lot of stuff. So it's going to need solar panels, windmills, batteries, EVs, sustainable aviation fuel, etc. Who is going to be making these things? So, paraphrasing John F. Kennedy, I would say, ask not what your country can do to decarbonize itself, ask what your country can do to help the world decarbonize. So, the goal is global decarbonization. Somebody has to make the things that will enable global decarbonization. Why not me? So I think this frame is much more constructive, and it gives a role to people to play that is more ambitious, that focus on what in many cases are quite pitiful emissions. So the questions we need to ask, and we have the methods to do that, to ask where are these things in the product space, which ones are near you, which ones would be more strategic for you because it would open up new avenues of change. And that's the approach we're taking. A second part of this story is what I like to call the end of the energy flat world. Oil is incredibly cheap to transport. And because oil is incredibly cheap to transport, it made the local availability of energy irrelevant for the determination of comparative advantage in energy-intensive industries. So you could have places like Japan, Korea, China, Germany, Belgium, exporting steel and importing energy. Green energy is very costly to move, both in time and in space. If you use it where it hits, it's super cheap. If you want to move it, it's super expensive. For example, solar panel can generate a megawatt hour for $20. That's $30 a barrel of oil equivalent. The US government is giving you $3 per kilo of hydrogen subsidy for you to transform that electricity into hydrogen. $3, that's $165 a barrel in subsidies. So if you want to go from solar to hydrogen, it's from 20 to 165. Okay, so it's much, much more expensive. So companies are going to have the option of paying that huge cost of transporting the energy or just moving. Either Mohammed goes to the mountain or the mountain goes to Mohammed. Maybe Mohammed is going to have to move. Okay. So in conclusion, there are many reasons why markets fail at technological adoption and adaptation and innovation. Industrial policy, or whatever you want to call this policy, needs to address these problems in identifying and solving coordination failures, missing public goods, attracting new industries and their missing capabilities, engaging with the different agents of change, stimulating the development of R&D capabilities for technological adoption, adaptation, innovation. While some enablers and finance may come from the EU, much of this depends on capabilities at the national and subnational levels, and make sure that the EU policies build up those capabilities rather than circumvent those capabilities, that they catalyze these local mechanisms that are able to solve these problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, for this extremely inspiring introductory lecture. I would like now to call on stage the speakers of this plenary. And I'm calling them. So, Deborah Revoltella, she's the director of the economics department at the European Investment Bank. Very welcome. Frank Nederlander is a Vice President for Governmental Affairs Europe at BMW. Welcome. Sylvia Schwarz-Serger, she's professor at University of Lund in Sweden. And then Kurt Vandenberg is Director General at DG Klima, European Commission. And then last but not least, John Seisman is a professor emeritus at the University of California, Berkeley. So we have an impressive lineup of speakers and a lot of topics to discuss. I think the introduction made by Ricardo really set the scene in terms of what industrial policy is, and it's very nice to hear it's not only about subsidies, it's actually much more than that, and the justification for industrial policy. And I have to say this is actually a nice starting point, because I mean, I've been in economics for almost 30 years, so that was my first encounter with economics, and except a first undergrad course on industrial economics, for about 20 years, industrial policy and industrial economics, it was not the mainstream or the main source of attention within economics. And then things changed. It was quite sudden. And I remember that exactly 4 years ago, under the drive of Andrea at SEPS, we set up a task force on the European industrial strategy. It was not even policy strategy. And this was something completely new. So for me, the first question is, what are the drivers of such changes, at least in the European context? And then it's really how can we make an understanding of these changes and what kind of industrial policy we need for Europe. Maybe just 2 minutes to share a bit and again to set the scene. I think 3 main changes actually happened in the last years. The first one, at least from a European perspective, I think is the fact that the multilateral rule-based system, which is really at the heart of the European construction and the source of prosperity in Europe, is under threat. The second one, I think, is the acknowledgement that technology is the main source of growth and power. And in this sense, what Ricardo highlighted, how technology is important, it's not only for economic growth, I think it goes behind, much behind that, and beyond that. And I think the race for technology supremacy between the United States and China is a demonstration of this. And last but not least, the climate emergency. So I think these 3 elements, which came in more or less at the same time, can justify or at least provide an understanding of why industrial policy has become now so important. And this basically is reflected on 3 broad objectives that the EU has put forward. The Green Deal, so decarbonization and the net zero, open strategic autonomy. This is really about, okay, in which kind of world we can continue to trade and how can we achieve some economic security. And the third one is competitiveness. So can we achieve all these objectives at the same time, and can we use industrial policy as a broad framework to set the policies to achieve these objectives? I think this is a very complex but a critical question if we want to understand what industrial policy can do. So with this in mind, I would like to ask each of the panelists to share their thoughts in a quite sharp way, and then we will have the opportunity also to interact. And I would like to start with Deborah. Yesterday, Vice President Šefčovič said very clearly that the European Investment Bank will play a key role for achieving the Green Deal. And it somehow indirectly gave the European Investment Bank a key role in industrial policy. Just a very small responsibility. Can you share your thoughts about the challenges, but also the opportunities offered by the Green Deal and all the transformations that we are experiencing?
Thank you very much. And it's really, I think, it's really nice being in an institution that every time that Europe has a huge challenge and needs to really deliver on that, everybody comes back to the EIB. So it's very good. And I think, in fact, we are an institution that can play a role in this specific context. The way in which I would frame it is we are in a moment of huge transformations, and it's exactly what you are saying. So we have the net zero transformation, digital, artificial intelligence, the deglobalization, but also the work to have transformation and more resilience value chains. And then we have the usual issue of aging population. And all of these requires a transformation of our economy. And I think what we have to keep in mind is that we are talking about industrial policy, strategies, policy, whatever, in a situation that is really of dramatic transformation and change. And to me, this is important. It's not a status quo environment in which you want to put in place policies, but it's really this transformation. So the real risk that I see is that policies have to be guided at the end by the competitiveness and productivity principle. In this moment of transformation, you have very much a risk that industrial policies actually are designed in a way that prevent the transformation and the transition and that end up delaying the transition. So it's very important to have a design that actually keeps productivity, competitiveness at the forefront. And that's why doing it at European level, maybe it's already an asset rather than doing at a national level and having more the focus on productivity, competitiveness, number one, and then looking at how to transform, how to ease the transformation of industries with this focus on productivity and competitiveness. What we are looking to do at the European Investment Bank, I think it's quite known. Our new president just came and discussed the new set of priorities that very much are a set of 8 priorities, but very much is everything related to the innovation side, to the net zero transition, but also a stronger focus on the social dimension, social investment in social infrastructure, where the social dimension actually can really be reconnected to the concept of competitiveness, and I will come back to that in a moment. But when we look at how to support industrial strategies or industrial policy, we start with looking more on a horizontal point of view. We have a very strong focus on the innovation side. I think particularly on the innovation part, I think it's well known Europe has lost in many areas on the innovation side, but still has a good positioning in terms of green innovation. And we think that actually working on this positioning on the green innovation is actually an opportunity. And it's an opportunity if you look at the fact that who leads in innovation and who sees the opportunities of the innovation is actually who is actually investing more, transforming more, and having a more spillover effect. So there is a positive cycle remaining at the frontier of the green innovation. We think that on the innovation side, at the European level, where we really have issues is maybe at the very start of the innovation process, but there is a big gap at the level of the scaling up of firms. And here we are, as an institution, we are actually working together with the Commission. We have a few examples that we think are quite relevant. One is the innovation funds. It uses the proceeds of the ETS to support innovative projects that have a financial demonstration effect. So it's really the way of using part of the structure that is encouraging the decarbonization, so the proceeds from the ETS, for financing the demonstration effect of projects. We also think that and that's maybe the thing going closer to industrial policies that actually we are doing. Example of scaling up production with some innovative demonstration projects like the Northvolt. That's quite innovative, I think, because it was the idea of developing green batteries very much in the north, in a close to production of energy, and creating a full environment that transforms around green technologies. And this, I think, it also has a lot to do with this combination of getting the opportunity of the net zero transition and having the social implication, because all of this means also developing activities in a certain region, creating a new skills and transformation, and this is something that has to be looked more. The other point that we are looking at is very much on the decarbonization side. So I was talking about innovation, but if we look at existing firms, we look on the more on analytical point of view, we detect, looking at the firms, the creation of this decarbonization divide. There are decarbonization leaders and decarbonization laggards. What is interesting is that the leaders are really those that are investing more, innovating more, and the innovation component is very strong on the leader sides, and they are those that can get the new opportunities. The laggards are not investing, they are not innovating at all, and they are planning to reduce production capacity. So you create a risk that at a certain point you will have a group of firms that by delaying the transition, I forgot to say they receive a lot, if they are in the ETS, a lot of free emissions. And you create a risk that by delaying the transition, and sometimes a policy is supported, that these firms will not make it to the switch to the new net zero world. So we try to give a strong message that delaying a transition may not be good. It may look good in the short term for social factors, but then if it goes to the point of bringing firms to a certain point where they will not make it in the transition, that's a long-term risk. And the last point I wanted to make is on fairness of the transition. I think there is, on the net zero transition, there is a huge social risk associated, and we see it. But on the other side, there is also an opportunity. And the opportunity that I see, but it's, we have a survey of firms that we do since 10 years, and every time we ask firms what is the major impediment, there are always a couple at the top, but the major impediment is always skills. Lack of skills, lack of available skills. And then if you look at who lacks skills, it's really all firms, but most importantly are the most advanced firms. So are those that are innovating, those that are more advanced in the net zero transition, etc. So we were trying to look at what does this removing this lack of skill, what does it make to firms? And we really see that it's blocking the frontier firms. So I think it's hard to do, but I think that a part of the answer is if we wanted to have industrial strategies or policies, also having a good strategy in terms of skills on retraining, on maybe also the social dimension. In many cases, if we are talking about absolutely lack of skills, workforce participation, maybe also projects on social infrastructure, social investment for labor force participation, like childcare, etc. Those can be part of a strategy because, in fact, it's something that is blocking particularly the barrier of firms. And it very much comes to the capacity to plan all of this and all the dimensions together. And I think one example that we have actually in the context of the just transition, one project that we recently co-financed together with also the Commission and National Initiative is the transformation of a region in Germany, Lusatia, that was used to be, the whole economy was used to be based on lignite, and the project of transformation has been going in all dimensions, including the social and skills part, but also rethinking the kind of industry that can be developed there. And that's one example of how to operate. So, just to conclude, I think yes, industrial strategies, yes, industrial policies, probably they need to be well designed and having in mind productivity and competitiveness at the center. And the last element, if well designed and given the skills gap that we have, maybe there is a possibility to try to work also around the firm part, thinking about competitiveness and not only about redistribution.
Thank you very much, Deborah. So it's quite complex. So complexity is, we go back to complexity. I would like now to move to Frank. I mean, we are speaking about industrial policy. I think it's important also to hear from those who are affected by this broad framework about how these new objectives, which are put forward by the Commission, but which are also becoming part of the policy and more broadly the social debate, are taken on board, and what are the challenges for the industry? Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much to be here in that panel. And personally, Pat, I should add, I came to Brussels like in last summer, and the government affairs part is the new part for me. I have a much more or a longer history in the industry itself, and I've seen different changes in history over 30 years. And at the time, 2019, when the Green Deal was launched, I was heading the foundation of the company and the family. And the foundation was promoting the 2030 agenda. And we were just in a period where 2016, you had to promote what the SDG were. And so I was quite amazed when the Green Deal was launched, because for two reasons. One, it was a kind of initiative from the EU promoting the transformation, at the same time based on European values, which had been different to values you had seen in different world regions, also from the business side. And what's happened now in the 5 years, and that was for me is the most important starting point for the next phase, is we have shifted for the question if we respond to how we respond. So no one is questioning anymore the targets and the need of decarbonization, but I think there's an important discussion needed how to translate it into the business opportunities. And then we are at the point where Europe is not an island, but has to look how other world regions, particularly the US and China, are acting on that way and acting on the way to lead this transformation. And having said that, the major discussion we'd like from the industry perspective to engage on is what are the instruments on a policy you could use to really strengthen that transformation. And as I said, I think it's less on the target side. The framework, that's a strong one and a good one. And I think together with the Paris alignment, there's a clear pathway to go there. But we have a different opinion how far regulation must go into technology, into regulating the business, and we'd like to engage more. And as Ricardo's presentation showed earlier on, how to hand over the complexity to those who have to deal with the complexity at the end, because we have to do the business. And that's what I liked when Mar Sefcovic yesterday mentioned his discussion with the US, where he quoted someone saying, okay, you have the Green Deal, but we have the business case to that. And I think that's a key imperative for the discussion, which now President von der Leyen has launched with the European competitiveness. And I think crucial discussion, and as I said, I'm new to that, but very curious to do, is how we translate the complexity. You raised the complexity of the transformation, which it's not only about raw materials, it's not only about some ingredients, but creating products, industry, production, which is competitive both in Europe, but also on world markets. I grew up in an industry, as I said, which had seen a lot of transformation in the 90s. We have seen Japan conquering the markets. We had to engage in the US. I experienced myself how China as a car market ramped up. And you had to face several challenges over time. And competitive for us was ever to be also competitive on those different areas. And that's something which sometimes I'm missing right now here in Brussels. Perhaps I have not the experience yet to engage in those discussions, but I think these are the elements I would like to bring from a personal experience into discussion on competitiveness. And at the end, I think your last chart mentioned it a little bit better. We need a mixture of platforms where to discuss for, and a different perspective perhaps on, let's say, the way towards. You mentioned agents, perhaps the European companies which are successful could be kind of agents to transfer. You mentioned the startup and market. I have some experience on that one. And you see, independent of the green transition, we are lacking of the risk capital market. We are lacking on scaling up on that. So it's not only a question about the sustainable transformation, it's a general question. So to sum up, I think it's all about the complexity, and it's all about to find a new, let's say, common ground, both from the regulation side and the industry side, to craft on pathways forward to be truly competitive from a business perspective, not from a regulations perspective only.
Thank you very much for bringing in this view. I mean, this element of complexity is returning, so I think we really need to try to do some work in breaking down the complexity to make it more manageable. So that's a task for all of us. I would like to move to Sylvia. Sylvia, you are a professor at university, but you have done quite a lot of work in advising countries and governments, so focusing especially on innovation policies. Can you tell us how this approach to innovation policy actually can be linked to industrial policy and how it can serve industrial policy?
Thanks a lot, Cynthia. And I think the presentation and the two interventions complement each other extremely well, because they also speak to something that I would like to come to, which is, first of all, I think like you said, Frank, I think we all agree on the overall framework, the European Green Deal. We don't, except for some camps, but there's sort of a lot of force and logic behind what we need to do. The problem is sort of in the instruments and the implementation. And I think that's a lot of what Ricardo talked about. Sort of the challenge for government is to solve problems and to increase their bandwidth, not to throw money around. And I think this is where we are at the intersection of this industrial policy debate. And as you said, Deborah, the risk right now is that industrial policy is actually focused on existing industries and existing technologies rather than on the future industries and the future technologies. And so I tried to clarify this, and then I'll come back to innovation. I tried to clarify this for myself because I think industrial policy is one of these fuzzy terms that we're throwing around right now that we can fill with whatever we want to fill it. And in one of your earlier versions of your presentation, Ricardo, you raised this question, who needs industrial policy? I think that's a super relevant question. And what do we need it for, right? So is it politicians who need it, or is it the European Green Deal that needs it? Or is it regions that need it? So I think this is a very relevant question. So I tried to find a definition. The OECD provided a definition of industrial policy as interventions to improve structurally the performance of the domestic business sector. I think that's a good definition because it doesn't talk about competitiveness. It talks about improving structurally. And for me, I read into that sustainability, for example, but also using state-of-the-art technology. So this is what I think is a good starting point for a definition of industrial policy. In reality, as you have also mentioned, Deborah, currently, right now, I would say we're drifting into sort of a 70s industrial policy, which is like an affair of member states. It's not a European industrial policy, it's member states. And as somebody mentioned in a conversation yesterday, then it boils down to incumbents and fiscal capacity. And that is a huge problem because it undermines cohesion and it undermines the single market. So I think this is the problem that we're facing with industrial policy right now, and we really need to get out of that very quickly. And coming to an innovation policy, I've spent 20 years working with innovation policy for the Swedish government. The most recent thing I did now as a researcher is look at the implementation of the recovery and resilience packages, which are supposed to go to also greening the industries. And as one high-level civil servant told me from the European Commission, looking at some countries, he said, The recovery and resilience packages have led to brand new bicycle paths, which I don't think is investing in new technologies. And it's not investing in new industries. So I think we have a problem with state capacity. We have a problem with using the same toolkit that we've been using forever to try and address this European Green Deal, and we're running the same risk with industrial policy. So I think there is a case for industrial policy, but it should be, in my mind, intimately linked to green. I think we shouldn't even have to say green. There should be no distinction between industrial policy and reducing emissions. I think it should focus on ensuring that the domestic business sector, as the OECD said, and that's the European business sector, can become a clean and a sustainable industrial sector, and that it can do it with state-of-the-art technology, because that's what's going to be necessary to do that. I think those are the two guiding lights. And how do we do that? I think we need to focus. I mean, I'm right now looking at the framework programs, the history of the framework programs. I think we need to go back to some of the original spirit of the framework programs, which is on pre-competitive research for industrial leadership and competitiveness. I think we need to look at demand. For some reason, we're getting better at understanding complexity, but we still end up at funding, right? At throwing money at things. And I think we need to think about how are we finally going to get public procurement right for sustainable transitions in the EU? How are we going to advance on our market integration? And potentially, how are we going to also look at something like we wrote a paper on a green DARPA, something that combines procurement with demand and with green environmental sustainability. I think it's possible. I think that could be Europe's competitive advantage. So I think those are my concerns when we talk about industrial policy. I think you've raised them all because I think we have to go back to state capacity and think about what can the state do and what should the state do. And I also really think we have to think about our toolkit, and we have to make sure that industrial policy does not undermine European cohesion and the single market, because then nobody is served, not the green transition and not the future of Europe.
Thanks very much, Silvia. You actually touched upon your last remarks two points which I think are crucial, and I'm sure we'll get back to them in a moment. But what you mentioned about the link between industrial policy and the Green Deal actually makes me serve to an easy transition to Kurt. Kurt, you were advisor when to President von der Leyen when the Green Deal was designed, and if my understanding was correct, the idea of rethinking the industrial policy was really to have an approach that would serve the achievement of the Green Deal goals. Then many things changed in the last couple of years. Where do we stand now?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that we very much welcome from an EU climate policy point of view this renewed interest for industrial strategy. We absolutely need it. Silvia, you asked who needs industrial strategy or policy? We need it for succeeding in our climate policy. That's very clear. When we launched the European Green Deal in 2019, Frank referred to 2019, we resolutely put it in the market as a new growth, investment and innovation strategy. Because we knew then, we know now even better that we can't grow our economy and make it competitive on the basis of fossil fuels and wastage of resources. So we need to find a new model of growth. We also knew that the green tech or the clean tech was an area where Europe had comparative advantage. Things have changed. Since then, we see that actually climate action globally is no longer an environmental policy. It is really becoming a finance and economic policy. And we see what is happening in the United States with the IRA. We see what China is doing in terms of clean tech, solar panels. So these countries, Ricardo, are actually asking themselves, what can we do to help decarbonize the world? There are studies showing that every ton of euro of CO2 saved in the US thanks to the IRA will lead to 2.5 tons saved elsewhere in the world. So these are very good spillover effects. But it does raise the question, what does this mean for Europe? Where do we stand with Europe in this? Now, we have legislated to have climate neutrality in law by 2025. We will reduce our emissions by 55% in 2030. We have the whole legislative framework in place now. We actually base ourselves on pricing, because we put a price on carbon. That's the core of our whole policy. So that's the pricing, the information that works in the markets, and we couple that with regulation where carbon pricing is not doing it sufficiently, and the whole funding framework remains very important. And there we have a very good partnership with the EIB, which was, of course, for us an essential partnership. What we do know, though, is that with Fit for 55, we will be creating a massive market for clean tech, green products, and green solutions in the future. We cannot afford that this market is only supplied from China and from the US. We need to make sure that the supply of this market is also from within Europe. And we can do this because if we now look at the project pipeline, it is overflowing. Remember 10 years ago, Mr. Juncker launched his Juncker plan. He brought a lot of money to the table, but there were no projects. We had to look around for projects. Today, the project pipeline is overflowing. We know this from our innovation fund, which is 6 times oversubscribed. We know this from the massive number of final investment decisions that are on the point of being taken but not taken yet. So that's where we need to go. That's why we need to give predictability for the future, because many of these investments take a longer time horizon than 5 years. They take 10, 15, 20 years. And that's also why we came with our communication on the 2040 climate target, to give that predictability and clearly say we will stay the course. What you see in that communication is that we make a very strong argument, I believe, for a real industrial policy. But what we need to do is to make much better a distinction between what is a competitiveness and innovation policy and what is an industrial policy. Too often we have confused the two, in my view. Competitiveness policy is about improving the framework conditions for all businesses in the single market. All businesses need access to finance, to skills, to clean, affordable energy, to the single market, to trade, etc. But then there are a couple of sectors which probably will not stay in Europe if we want them to decarbonize. And sectors that we need for the green transition. One is the clean tech manufacturing, where we have made progress now with the Net Zero Industry Act. We have said 40% of clean tech that we need in the future needs to be manufactured in Europe. The other one are the energy intensive sectors like steel, aluminium, fertilizers, etc. We also need those sectors to stay in Europe. For them, it's not a question of technology. They know how to decarbonize this. Actually, we invest in green steel in Sweden. 2 big plants we are investing in. Their order books are full. But their problem is, what is the business case for them to invest in Europe? And for those areas, which are also important for strategic autonomy and our security considerations, we need an industrial policy that is very targeted to those. That includes the need for financial support, but that can only be done, and there I fully agree with Sylvia, that can only be done at EU level. Otherwise, we risk a fragmentation. I can go into details how we can do this, but it's clear that we are developing the tools for doing this, even if we don't get much more money in the future in the EU budget, because we have to be realistic. So it's a question of pooling national and EU resources for doing this and having very competitive mechanisms to support those industrial sectors. And just to finish in this, the dialogues with industry will be incredibly important, but we need to find the right formats for this so that we don't fall in the trap of incumbency, but that we really look at ecosystems, at value chains, and not at very precise sectors, because then we would fall in the trap of incumbency and vested interests.
Thanks very much, Kurt, also to be so clear on the need for industrial policy and how, but also some of the trade-offs that we are faced with. I would like now to move to John. 2 things. Inflation Reduction Act was mentioned, so how the United States comes into the picture, and maybe the broader question on do we need industrial policy, and for what purpose in 2024?
Being with a last name starting with a Z, I'm used to speaking last and used to also facing a compressed amount of time as a result of that. So I'm going to try and be both compressed and direct. I would also add that I've been working on these issues, some of my friends in the audience know, for more decades than many of you have been around thinking about them. Starting back in the Carter administration when Laura Tyson and I did a book called American Industry and International Competition, which flowed into some of the policy debates then. I've been working with governments in Europe, Asia, and the United States and firms since then. That said, I should also remark that the program we started, BRIE, was started with the folks who created Silicon Valley. They were the folks who helped us start that program. I want to make 4 points. The first is that in this world of supply networks and production chains emphasized by Ricardo and by others, the talk of self-sufficient autarky is beside the point. And in fact, what really becomes necessary, as Michael Schoenstein remarked yesterday, is if we're even going to talk about technological sovereignty, we need very clear specifications of what that means, or else it's not an operational concept. What is clear is that for all countries, the United States, Europe, our principal allies in Asia, participating in the development and deployment of advanced technology is required. And it means having access to those technologies and an anchor point in the supply chain so one has a position to negotiate with that. ASML has an anchor point in the semiconductor chain. TSMC has a dominant choke point in that, but those sorts of positions are essential, and all of us will be trying to pursue them. They do not require the exclusion of others. The second point is we've all been pursuing policies that are loosely industrial policies for a long time, whether it's aircraft or steel. I got engaged in the steel conversations back when, which circled not around technology, but really around trade policy. And I think, therefore, what is new in this being these policies, whether it was DARPA or whatever it was, is that we've now relabeled the group of them once again as industrial policy. That's somewhat new. And I think part of the reason, speaking to your question, is there's this onslaught of American policy that has emerged under that labeling on 3 different domains. One is national security, because be very, very clear, national security is behind the CHIPS Act. It is the driving force behind the CHIPS Act inside the government and outside. It is long before generative AI began to become an issue. Climate, as you're suggesting, is a second domain, with the question being what do we need to do to make the transition to a green economy? And of course, production and jobs, not only because it's an abstractly good thing, but because it tends to touch elections. And politicians tend to like economies that are providing their constituents with gains. Now, what's distinctive, and the third point is about all of these domains, climate, national security, jobs and production, is they all require alliances and coalitions. Much as Ricardo was suggesting, there are lots of letters out there. The question of how you combine them and with whom you combine them becomes the critical question. Since it can't be done in an autarkic kind of fashion, the question is what kinds of coalitions are needed. The difficulty is some of those coalitions are conflicting. So the Green Coalition really requires a broad agreement amongst a wide array of countries about how you're going to, in fact, decarbonize. It also requires a question of how you develop the tools and technologies to try and do that. The national security issue, the semiconductor issue, the AI issue, clearly has requires an alliance amongst strategic allies and has been orchestrated to exclude China. Notice the problem. When we started, it was the U.S.-Japan trade wars. Sometimes it all starts slipping back in, excluding China. And the broader issues of the development and the extent of production more broadly is that the development of the transatlantic alliances and the alliances with Asia really are the question of the terms on which those arrangements can be made, not whether they should exist. So I would say there are really two objectives now, and then a quick comment on how to try and address them. But one objective for all of us is how to assure an adequate and competitive supply of the products and technologies needed to achieve economic prosperity and security, and how to be a major participant in the production and development of those goods. The second is how to secure a position in the development of those technologies. Now, to be very quick, since we're running out of time, operationally, what I think, and Laura and I, in our discussions in the government and elsewhere about semiconductors, have called for a policy approach of CRIS, competitive, resilient, secure, sustainable policies. Let's not worry about trade policy, open trade. Let's not worry about autarky. How do we, in fact, make these markets accessible and competitive? And that we can discuss that. And the second issue that we feel very strongly about, and in the semiconductor domain pushed very strongly for, was can we do joint pre-competitive, in particular, technology development in the kind of notions that the semiconductor commons that have been developed actually are involved in. So we can all participate in and see our futures in the technology future. Equally important, setting up these kinds of semiconductor commons has the possibility of spelling out the kinds of rules of the governments, of the firms. In other words, if your government doesn't believe in intellectual property, you can't play. I.e., if the Chinese don't want to enforce intellectual property rules, maybe their firm shouldn't be part of the semiconductor technology. Maybe we can recreate a workable set of trade rules for a CRIS system by starting from the bottom up. So that's really how we've been looking at those issues.
Thank you very much, John. So, yes, I suggest we take 50 more minutes. We can still keep the break of 30 minutes and we start the next session 15 minutes later. So I would like to open immediately the floor for questions, and I would like to take 3 questions. I see already some hands. Daniel, there is a gentleman over there and another one at the end of the room.
Yeah, many thanks. Excellent presentation by Ricardo and very nice panel. I wanted to start with this bon mot, ask not what you can do to decarbonize your country, but what you can do to decarbonize the world. And then I look at China and say, maybe they're the ones who are doing the most to help us decarbonize the world, because they are producing a lot of so-called green goods very cheaply, right? Solar panels, wind turbines, electrical vehicles, and all of those the EU is uncertain whether she actually likes China to be the main supplier. And then, Courtier said, we need to have a green industry. We need to produce these key products for the green transition in Europe. That is not obvious to me. That is not at all obvious. I mean, if you want to follow as many letters as possible that Ricardo advocated, and if you want certainly to look at the new industries, right, which might emerge, why on earth should we say we need to have our photovoltaic industries, our wind turbines, and our batteries produced at home? That is really not self-evident.
Okay, second question.
My question, Tim Bute, Technical University of Munich.
So can you introduce yourself? I'm sorry.
Tim Büte, Technical University of Munich. Thank you. My question directly goes to Ricardo, but it also actually goes to the rest of the panel. You mentioned Japan somewhat in passing as a point of reference, at least. And for many decades, of course, Japan's industrial policy was seen as a tremendous success. In recent years, that's been more questionable. So in a direct way, my question is, what went wrong? And the broader question is, do countries at the technological frontier need a different industrial policy from countries that are trying to catch up, which were your point of reference in the beginning? Thank you.
Thank you. And there was another question at the back of the room.
Milan Petit from the Systems Transformation Hub. What do you see as the role for interregional cooperation to push this boundary to, let's say, without having these extra letters, to have access to these letters? And especially in a European context, how can the EU support this interregional cooperation?
Thank you. I would like to ask the panelists to respond. Ricardo, a couple of questions were directly addressed to you, indirectly also, maybe also Daniel, so please.
So, first of all, let me thank you all for very interesting discussion and comments. I'll take Daniel Gross's question that in some sense refers to Kurt's statements. And I want to say that I really agree with the thrust of his comment. I think Europe is the continent in the world with the biggest energy deficit. It's the biggest net importer of energy. As we move green, and that energy hard to move, it's a dense place, renewable energies are very dispersed, there's not enough energy. I mean, you'll have plenty of use in Europe for your energy. I don't think investing public resources in trying to keep energy-intensive industries in Europe is going to be smart. I want to think of the opportunity cost of those funds. Caio is here, and he's half German, half Brazilian. I don't know what. Doesn't have to add to one. Can add to more than one, but Brazil has a strategy to try to use their renewable energy and attract industries, and they're going to lure German industries there. If they do, it'll be efficient for the world. There are plenty of ways in which Europe can make money. In other ways, we're wasting the world's sun, we're wasting the world's wind, we're wasting a lot of the world's stuff for a policy that's less about reducing global emissions and more about keeping jobs in Europe. And I think that the problem of jobs is not going to be an important problem. We're going to see the next problem. And here, the second question is about Japan and what went wrong. I'm just finishing a paper on Japan, and I think that Japan is a good image of the future because all the indicators of productivity and market share and so on of Japan are trending in the wrong direction. But that's because we look at what things are happening in Japan, not what is happening with Japanese firms. So Japan is exporting less because Japanese firms are exporting more outside of Japan. And Japan is making a ton of money out of their investments abroad. These investments abroad have excess returns, very high returns. So if you sort of like market value the assets Japan has abroad, their market to book ratio is about a factor of 2. So they have several $1 trillion that they have made in their investments abroad. They are the largest recipient of IP licensing revenues in the world. So what's been happening is that they've been getting old. There are not too many workers in Japan. They have plenty of ideas. They are deploying those ideas in the rest of the world, and there are many making money out of the deployment of those ideas in the rest of the world. I think that that's something that could happen in Europe, right? You want to mix your ability to produce ideas with other people's willingness to work, with other people's sun, wind, resources, and I think that's a more promising avenue. By the way, it's the only way you can make an international deal, and this is going to be my answer to the third question of interregional cooperation. What do you want to tell the South about decarbonization? You want to tell them, I want you to decarbonize by using my solar panels, by using my windmills, by using my stuff. I'm going to lend you the money. You have to pay me back. What are you going to pay me back with? I have not defined any constructive role for you to have in this world. So if you don't have any constructive role to have in this world, why the hell are you going to borrow money from me that you won't be able to pay? Right? So just don't decarbonize. But it's going to be very different if they see a role for themselves in supplying the needs of a decarbonizing world. And so I think there's much more to be, I think we need a more kind of like open architecture industrial policy for Europe that really, if we want to talk about decarbonization, it's not about Europe achieving net zero. If Europe achieves net zero, global emissions decline by 9%. If you're going to achieve net zero, it's because Europe is going to make money by enabling the world to decarbonize in a way that makes the world prosper with Europe. And I think that the last things I would want to see is you to waste money trying to make steel, trying to make fertilizers at home, when you'd have so much better things to do with that money.
Okay, that was a clear message. Kurt.
Thank you for the clear message. Let's keep aside the motivations of China. It's clear that there are areas where we have lost comparative advantage and areas where we still have comparative advantage. We are still in clean tech, leading in wind energy, especially offshore. We need to hurry up to keep that, but we continue investing in these electrolyzers. We still have an edge. In area of heat pumps, we still are ahead. So these are areas where we really need to invest to make sure that Europe keeps the leading edge on this. Solar panels is different. There, I think we have lost the race. And I agree with those who say that actually China is doing a service to the world with exporting all these cheap solar panels. However, where we need to look at is what is the next frontier in solar panels, with new technologies, new materials, perovskites, much more circular, a much lower carbon footprint, hybrid solar panels that are better integrated in the whole energy system, etc. That's where Europe can still gain an edge, knowing that the rest of the world will then also catch up. We, by the way, don't say that our market will be closed. We don't go for autarky. We say that globally speaking, we would like to see 40% of the clean tech that we need manufactured in Europe, but always with this very strong innovation frontier that we want to push, very much linked to the development of a circular economy, to make sure that we don't waste resources, that we keep resources in a closed loop. On the energy-intensive industries, we believe it is important to keep production of energy-intensive goods and products also in Europe. Not everything of it, but a critical minimum mass, because these are sectors that are very important to have the whole value chain innovation happening in Europe as well. Secondly, we need to be less naive than in the past. We know what the geopolitical developments are. We have seen what price we have paid for being very dependent on almost a sole supplier of gas and oil. This has cost us very dearly, so we need to take that into account as well. And we also are very clear that these future investments in energy-intensive industries will have to align with the energy endowments, not only within the EU, but also broader than the EU in our neighborhood, be it Ukraine, be it Northern Africa, etc. So we're not looking only at the EU, we're looking at the broader Europe and its neighborhood, if you like. That's why, for example, we invest in green steel manufacturing with our innovation fund, 2 plants that we have in Sweden. Why? Because the energy is there. The renewable energy is there. It makes sense to do there. So that's a point, a comment I also have for Ricardo. You say we need smart diversification rather than smart specialization. I think what you could argue this at global EU level, general EU level, there we need smart diversification. But I do believe we still need more smart specialization within Europe. To give an example, it doesn't make sense that Germany invests heavily in the production of renewable hydrogen if this can be produced much more cost efficiently in the south of Europe. But then, of course, we need to make sure that there are interconnectors, pipelines, between the south of Europe and Germany, so that Germany has access to that relatively cheap renewable hydrogen as well. So that's a kind of planning for smart specialization that we need to do much better at the EU level than we've done so far, I believe.
Thank you very much. 1 minute for Deborah and then for John.
I just want to come back to Daniel's point, and I like, of course, we are aligned what Kurt is saying. I have to say with the economy start that I always have in mind the concept that for mature technologies, you don't care where they are produced and where are the innovative technologies. That's where you really should put your effort. So I think finding the balance will be something that where we work on the implementation phase will be very important, and I think it's what Kurt is saying with his second intervention. The other point that I want to say, it's true we are talking about industrial strategies, industrial policy, but if we look at in the net zero, where are the advantage and the constraint of firm in this moment? I think Europe, with certainty on the regulation side, that's a very strong point, pro-Europe. Firms may complain on the regulation, but it's there, and it's something that there are regulations, there are definitions, and it's there, and it's an important asset. Uncertainty, it's really what drives back. There is one element of uncertainty that still remains a lot, and Kurt was just mentioning it indirectly. Where will energy come from? I was yesterday in Germany. Germany doesn't know where energy will come from. And you are mentioning it could come from here, it could come from there, it could be hydrogen, it could be renewable. I think Europe was great when the corridors were defined, implemented, etc. That's probably the next step, is really having a view where energy will come from. And that's, to me, is at the heart of the net zero transition. We can have all the incentive on industrial policy, but we have to have the energy picture in mind.
John.
Very, very briefly, in response to Daniel, I'll have a discussion with Tim later. I think the first thing is one never wants to have a choke point. And the risk is that if China dominates this, there really is a choke point. The second is that industrial policy in China is driving the advantage of at least some of these industries. And then the question becomes whether you want the industrial policy of another country to shape the industrial structure of yours. And I think that's not acceptable. And the third point is this is as you're remarking, a geostrategic, geopolitical issue in the case of China. But lastly, and picking up on what Ricardo was remarking about the interregional part of this, if you think about what's the real issue with the Yellow Vests, the Yellow Vests were basically being asked to make their contribution to decarbonization at their expense. So that in fact we basically move production and jobs out of Europe to just accept imports in that way. Yes, there's dislocation. Yes, there may be a future, but those are the folks who are going to be damaged, and the political support for the kind of transition we need will evaporate. So I think that the geostrategic and the political foundations really require maintaining that in the United States as well as Europe in a collaborative way.
Thank you. And to conclude, I would like to give the last word to Kurt about EU policy challenges and opportunity for next decade.
Thank you, Cynthia. I would need an hour for that, which we don't have. I would like to start by thanking everyone for this very interesting discussion, really insightful. Of course, for an EU official, and I hope for many in this room, it's great to hear Ricardo Hausmann say that he has huge respect for the EU as a civilizational project. Obviously, we succeed probably, or we have succeeded because we had a dreadful war in Europe, and the EU was built as a peace project because we never want this anymore. So it's very sad for us to see that we have war again on this continent, which is dreadful. But it also means that the EU, as a peace project, will have to change and is changing quite a bit. Because we don't only have the real war at our borders, we are increasingly seeing that there are risks of trade wars, for which we also need to be prepared. And what we should not forget is that we're also at war with our planet. We are waging a war on our ecosystems, on which we depend so much. So that's also why the Green Deal and the continuation of the Green Deal, whatever name we give it, will be crucial for the future. You know, when we launched the Green Deal in 2019, we were surfing on a wave of popular support. Fridays for the Future, Greta Thunberg, European Parliament elections, etc. Everyone wanted us to be climate ambitious. But we were rather alone in the world. Donald Trump had withdrawn the US from the Paris Agreement, and China was not on our radar as a green power. Today, the situation has reversed. We see a lot of questioning in the public about the Green Deal, what it will cost us, is this affordable, what will it mean for me? Often legitimate, but also very often because of disinformation that is raging in our society right now. But we're no longer alone in the world in doing this. We actually now see that succeeding with our Green Deal, or at least our climate ambition, is becoming existential, not only from an ecological point of view, but also, and maybe even more, from an economic and security point of view. And on top of that, we see the growing impacts of climate change that are really growing by the day. We know that over the last 12 months, we have exceeded the 1.5 degrees warming. We need to realize that Europe is warming at double that rate. So in the best scenario, we will have to live with a 3 degrees warmer climate in Europe. And that means that the extremes that we are currently experiencing will become the new normal in the next decade. Actually, our generation is probably the last generation that knows what a normal, stable climate will have been. That's how serious it is. So we have to stay the course on the Green Deal and our climate ambition. We have everything in place now for 2030. All the regulations are there. We now need industry, business, the markets to deliver. It's very much an investment agenda. So, as I said before, in other occasions, the next commission, in my view, will need to be an investment commission. And we will need to look at the regulation, not to deregulate, but to have regulatory hygiene, as I call it, so that we clean up in the regulatory framework where there are inconsistencies, contradictions, and where there are inhibitors to the innovation that we need at scale. We need to go beyond 2030, have this predictability. That's why we published our 2040 communication. And all this, again, is about investments. And the investment bank is for us a crucial partner, as I said. The investments we need are very significant. They're not a walk in the park, but they are doable. In terms of size, we invested with Europe 0.9 trillion euros in the past decade on energy, transport and decarbonization. This decade, it will have to be between 1.2, 1.3 trillion euros. Next decade, 1.5 trillion euros, knowing that 1/3 has to come from the public, 2/3 from the private sector. This is doable, but it's only doable if we really are resolute in the principle of cost efficiency. Cost efficiency means several things. One, that we don't fund everything from the public sector, but that we share risk in a proper way with the private sector. So for us, the search is on for new financial instruments that share the risk. For example, the EIB has recently given 5 billion of counter guarantees to the wind sector. Great. This has really done a fantastic thing for the wind sector. Last year, we installed in Europe 17 gigawatts of additional wind capacity. So this is a sector that has a future in Europe. Second point, we need to exploit to the maximum the single market. If we don't use the single market, it will not be cost efficient in terms of smart specialization, in terms of developing the capital markets union. I'm very much in favor of what Christine Lagarde at the ECB says, that we need above all a green CMU to mobilize all those savings that are in our economy and channel this to the overflowing project pipeline that we currently have. But we also need to make much better use of synergies between EU and national funding. Allow me 1 minute to say what we're doing with the Innovation Fund, which is resourced by the revenues from emission trading. We have 40 billion this decade for supporting industrial decarbonization. We have launched the first ever auction, a European auction for subsidizing the production of renewable hydrogen with 800 million euros. Enormous success. Again, very much oversubscribed. So it means the know-how, the commitment, the willingness to do this is here in Europe. But what the good thing was about this is that Mr. Habeck, in the midst of the most painful budgetary discussions ever in Germany, has agreed to top up this 800 million with 350 million euro of its own money. And so we will fund the bids until our budget is exhausted. And then Mr. Habeck will come in and will pick up and fund the bids from Germany, but selected through a European mechanism. And we offer state aid facilitation. We have agreed with DG Comp that this does not require another state aid clearance, because this is agreed ex ante. And this is something we now want to do across the board. We're now looking at whether we can do this also for battery manufacturing, manufacturing of sustainable batteries in Europe. And we have agreed through the STEP, a recent agreement with Council and Parliament, that all the cohesion funds, recovery resilient funds, just transition funds are flexibilized so that countries from the south and the east that don't have the deep pockets as some others have can use all these funds to also top up these kind of European auctions. So this is a way of having a real competitive, innovation-oriented, single market-based industrial strategy. Last point I would like to make is that we need to succeed this decade with decarbonizing our economy, but the real frontier is for the next decade, where it will not be about decarbonization, but about dematerialization. The real frontier, the real industrial opportunity for Europe is to create a circular economy, because our planet needs it. We have used in the last 6 years as many resources and materials as in the whole 20th century combined. This is not sustainable. But if we move from a model of mass production to a model of mass customization of goods and services, using the latest technologies possible, then we have a real opportunity for our industry and business in Europe, and an opportunity to keep our planet livable as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kurt. Thank you very much to everyone. It was a bit longer than foreseen, but I hope you agree with me. It was really worthwhile. I sincerely learned a lot of things this morning.
Pleasure, sir.
We now have a coffee break, and the parallel sessions will resume at 11:30. Okay. I know. Thank you.